Today, questions and answers, part 2. Otherwise, I think known as Babies and Bathwater, part 2.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
So we, as I stated in the opening line there, are proceeding with what we began a couple of episodes ago in a discussion about the tests of Christianity. The idea being just that I have inquiries from brothers and sisters in Christ, especially sometimes at a church that I'm preaching at, sometimes from the college where I'm the president, Criswell College, sometimes just in relationships that I have with people who encounter me in different Christian contexts. But the point is, they've run into something that causes them some curiosity about how it should be resolved. And often the resolutions leave you with another problem. And it just, it leaves us with a bunch of dilemmas that we don't know how to resolve. And so on some of these questions, I just thought we should talk about where the nuances are and where some of the issues are that come up that leave us stranded when we're looking for answers sometimes. And so the one I talked about first was the tests of Christianity. What does it actually take to be saved? If a person believes this, doesn't believe it, didn't know about it, and then comes to believe it or stops believing it, is that something that would negate their faith in Christ or would make it null and void so that they, blah, blah, blah. We talked about a lot of that stuff in the previous episode. This is a completely different question. Think of it as we're in an auditorium and someone asked a question over here about the tests of Christianity, and we talked about it for a little while. And now we're moving on to the next question. Oh, what's our next question? And pointing to a different part of the auditorium, the next question. So it's a little unfair because it's not actually a question. So it's but it resolves into a question, as you'll hear in just a moment. The title I would give it is The Revolutions of Change. I'll explain why that is in a little bit. And I will say, if I don't get back to it later, subtly underneath all of this, in that language, the revolutions of change, is the irony that's present in the nature of revolutions, which is based on a book by Hannah Arendt. Just thought I ought to mention that. It's called On Revolution. Well worth reading. Fantastic history. Really insightful, as you would expect me to say about anything she writes. So anyway, but it's true. It really is worth reading. If you haven't read it, so you got to put it on your list, and you need to read the book On Revolution. Anyway, this point that I want to talk about today, it usually doesn't originate as a question. Again, I've heard it over and over and over again in different ways, just like I had the one about, what it actually take. What do you have to know to be saved? Just like I've heard that a lot. I've heard this a lot. But it is more of a description of what an inquirer regards as something odd that's emerged in their relationship, some kind of relationship that they have. So, for instance, in an original relationship that a church has with a pastor, everything is just so great. I mean, this is the guy, and the Spirit of God moved, and this is the person who's now going to lead us into, in I know this is empty rhetoric, the promised land. And of course, no one says that. But it is, he's going to take us to the next step and all those kinds of things. And so you have the question being provoked when they say, oh, why didn't it turn out that way? Something went awry. Something happened wrong. And so with a pastor, it happens when I'm speaking with, and again, this happens a lot. Not every church, not every pastor, but I've had a lot of conversations over these 4 decades in ministry with pastors who are saying, I went to this church. I told them what I was going to do. I told them we're going to eliminate the choir, we're going to start using different music, we're going to learn to do evangelism every day, or we're going to focus on disciple making, or we're not going to have a country club church, and we're not going to, whatever. And it's all winsome language, and it all sounds great. And so they're like, I told them everything I was going to do. I gave them a step-by-step plan in the interviews that I did with the search committee, and the congregation heard it in my, test sermon, when I came in view of a call. Daisy always laughs when I use that expression. Apparently in Oregon, they don't say such things. But anyway, the point is, the pastor, he's sitting here in front of me saying, I told them everything I was going to do, and now that I'm starting to do it, they're balking at my leadership, looking at me like they had no idea it was going to involve that. And over again, I've been invited to congregations where the pastor has abruptly left or been dismissed, one way or the other. The church has ended up without a pastor, and it was because the congregation was surprised that the pastor was doing some of the things he was doing or pushing some of the agendas that he began to push. And they're surprised because they're like, well, we interviewed the guy. We talked with him. We understood where he was coming from. We knew what he was going to do. And we felt like we understood the style of leadership that he had. And it turned out that he was autocratic, or it turned out that he, couldn't bring about the things he said, or whatever it was. And they're confused. How did this happen? It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing that comes up when couples are surprised that the honeymoon ends. I mean, it's an idiom in our language. It's literally an expression in our language for other relationships. Oh, well, the honeymoon's over, talking about somebody at work, for instance. I got a new job, and, well, now the honeymoon's over, or the shine's off the apple, meaning the same thing. It's just an expression. And yet couples are still shocked when the honeymoon ends. It was just so great for the first 2 weeks. I'm just joking. 6 months or 2 years or whatever the period of time is. And eventually it's like, but, it's just not the same anymore. Really? I'm shocked. Tell me about the change. I'm being overly sarcastic, but I mean, shouldn't everybody know the honeymoon's going to end? That's why, it's a honeymoon. It's a brief time that you have together. And I see exactly the same thing in friends who start a business together, where you want to sit down with them and say, now, do you value your friendship more than you value this business, or do you value the business more? Because if you value the friendship more, don't do it because your friendship's going to be temporary. I know I don't mean to speak in universals, like it always ends that way, but it does. I mean, not always. There are, I'm sure, exceptions that someone can find. I just don't happen to have found the exceptions yet. Or siblings who are adults who are trying to do something together. Well, certainly we can do it together. And I can see how that sometimes survives, even though they may not be aware of some of the discomfort that's involved in it. Anyway, my point is, it comes up because people are saying, I thought we'd be able to do this. I don't understand why we weren't able to arrive at the state we wanted to arrive at. And so I want to take the first example because it's the world that I swim most freely in, the nature of churches and organizations that are being led by a pastor and, trying to get to where they believe God wants to take them as a congregation. You would think having this unified commitment to the resurrection and the lordship of Jesus would just get us on the same page and at least let the escalator carry us to wherever it is he wants to take us. But it just doesn't happen that way. But I think you could apply what I'm about to say in this context to just about anything, which for all the believers who are listening, should give you concern. Pause. Wait a minute. Relationships inside the church are functioning basically identically to relationships outside the church. Yeah, that should cause us some concern. There should be something different about the way we live in relationship with each other based on the fact that we're believers. But a lot of times there's not. And in some ways there shouldn't be, obviously, because we're still humans. And we are not perfected. And so we're going to run into some of the same rough patches that everyone else would run into. That should not be a surprise. So don't take it as an insult. It's just part of the reality of what we experience. Anyway, my point in saying it is that what I'm going to describe, what I am describing about what happens in churches between pastors and congregations would apply to any organization. It's something, it's just something I just don't think there are any exceptions. It happens all the time. So what happens is, the way I see it, by the way, is with pastors, especially and it's weird how predictable this is, at 2 and 5 years, and sometimes at 7 years, if they're very slow to arrive there. But it is those numbers. I mean, at 2 years, it is a predictable event. It's a survivable event, but it's a predictable event, and it happens almost everywhere at 2 years. Let me tell you why I'm saying this, because I do it all the time. I sit down with that pastor, or I'll sit down with that search committee chairman who's surprised at where they are right now, or with the deacons who are trying to figure out blah, 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 or whatever. I will sit down with them, and after they describe what's going on, I will say, and it's a little different at each of these periods, so I can usually guess the right year, but I will say, how long has the pastor been there? About 2 years? Is that? Yeah, he came 2 years ago, as it turns out. Because there is a reality in the nature of ministry. So what I'm describing that's happened is the pastor will say, man, I'm surprised at the level of conflict that's emerging right now. The number of people who I thought were really on my side, and now it turns out they've turned against me, or they've started having meetings and saying, I don't think he's the right guy for us, or whatever. Something dramatic has brought about an end to this sense that everything was just going to continue moving forward. But it only happens after a few years. So let's say it's 2 years. At 5 years, it's a little more dramatic. At 7 years, it's usually one or the other has to go. Either the church is going to die or the pastor's got to go. Or, the congregation's going to split in some way. And obviously that doesn't happen everywhere. But you'd be surprised how often it does happen. Anyway, the point is, why does that happen? This is me converting this description of what's going on into a legitimate question. Why is this happening to me? Is what a person could say if they wanted to put it into a question. And the answer is not, I don't think it's all that complicated. So the first part of the answer, why is this happening now after 2 years? Why is this happening after 5 years? I mean, what changed that this is what's going on? And actually, it is change that changed. That is something. So I guess the simple way to say it would be this. At some point, a congregation realizes that the new guy is no longer the new guy. He's somebody that intends to stay. That's usually the 2-year point where people realize that. Oh, wait a minute. We're not just having fun with a new speaker and he's got a different style and the programs he has are creative and interesting and, oh, this is fun, isn't it? And wow, isn't it a great feeling? And then around 2 years normally, congregations kind of go, oh, was he going to stay? You mean, so the things he does when they're not new, we're still supposed to like them? I mean, I liked it when it was new, but I don't sit down and watch the same movie every night. So what am I supposed to do after 2 years of the same movie? A pastor is the same movie over and over again. If he's not, he's probably lacking some consistency that you do want. So, how do you do that? At that point, what you're realizing, and the reason it comes to a head, and especially at 5 years and 7 years, the reason it comes to a head is because the congregation is finally realizing that something might need to change in the congregation. Meaning, oh, we got a new pastor. That was dramatic and that was exciting. And now he expects something to change with us. We were okay how we were without him, which sort of implies that you didn't really want someone to lead in any way. You just wanted things to continue as they were, which is what most of us want. Even when we say we want change, what we really want is for things to continue as they are with the same desire for change that we had in the past that's unrealized. That's just how people are. It's us, all of us, including me. We all live that way. And so it works both directions. Pastors sort of lose their patience with their congregation. I don't know why they're resisting me so much. Congregations lose the enamored feeling they had for their pastor, and they can't figure out why he's so mundane now when he was so exciting when we got started, as if a 30th date is supposed to be like a first date. But it's exactly the same if you were to, again, put it in relational terms, individual, personal relational terms. It's the same thing as that couple that was surprised the relationship ended the way it did. So the first problem, the first reason that it comes up like this is that change takes time. And it's not possible when you're hearing somebody say, oh, this is the change we're going to introduce, then it's all exciting and good. But so I'm going to say this both directions. Because change takes time, you don't realize the impact of the change until that time has passed. And when the impact of the change hits, that's when you really decide whether you want it or not. And you didn't already have it, so you're not really sure you wanted it to begin with. On the one side, it's because the change takes so long to come. And on the other side, it's the same thing, but it's sort of inverse of that. No matter how much you explain that you're bringing change, you can't bring it immediately. It takes a long time for it to get there. And so on the pastor's side or the congregation's side, there's an awareness now that change is coming, and that creates some discontentment. Or on the pastor's side, normally, there's an awareness that it's going to take a long time for this change to happen. I don't know if I want to endure all the negative stuff that's going to happen between now and when the change actually happens. So let me give you a simpler example to visualize how this happens. I don't have a strong opinion on whether a church should give a traditional invitation or not. I believe in them in the sense that I know people whose lives are changed in the moment they walk down an aisle and make a public profession of faith, for example, or commit themselves to some new cause that God has called them to. And I've been in many, many, many services with invitations that were revolutionary or transformative in the impact that they had on that congregation or on the spirit of that, series of services or whatever was going on. So I value that, and I understand the value of it. At the same time, a few decades ago, let me clarify, in my ministry, I had a comeuppance, a reckoning with my own calling, and realized that my ministry was not about getting people, I was not about having successful invitations. I learned to do that under someone who did it extremely well, or manipulatively, depending on, your attitude about that person. I'm not going to talk about that person right now, but the point is, I learned from that person. So I know how to give an invitation, and I know how to sort of motivate people to respond, hopefully because they've been stirred by the Spirit of God and they need to respond, and I'm just removing barriers for them. That's how I thought of it while I was doing it. But there did come a time in my own ministry, my own relationship with God, and I know how susceptible to, confirmation bias our personal interactions with God are outside of scriptural mandates and such. But I mean, the Spirit of God is real, and we have to be able to have the conversation. And I think God knows how to communicate effectively and hopefully can overcome some of the biases that are present in us when we're listening to him. So best I could tell, overcoming as many of the biases as I could come up with in the moment, I really did have a time where I had a comeuppance in my relationship with God that was not my calling, to give invitations where a lot of people would come forward and would respond. That my calling was to give messages, to deliver messages from the Scriptures that could in some way take root and just plant a seed for something he would do in them in the long run. That became my ministry. It's not an evaluation of what other people's ministry should be. All of us have different gifts and different callings. It's the nature of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. I'm just describing mine. So in my particular sense of what my calling is and my purpose is in giving a message, it was an awareness that I was no longer looking for a quick response. I wasn't looking for the change that would happen tonight. What I was looking for was the change that would emerge over days and weeks and months and years to follow. And there's a part of me that's frustrated by that because I don't get to walk out of events or church services where I can say, "Oh, look at that! We had this many decisions or this many that," and that's just not my focus. And it is satisfying when you get to see those things, and I do get to see those things in other contexts, so I love that. But in my ministry, in the things that I'm particularly called to, I sort of committed myself to a ministry that would not have that immediate feedback. And over the years, I learned that was worth waiting for. And those rare occasions where I hear of the response that came years later, or from people whose whole commitment to Christ is different now because of something that they considered over time, either I'm talking in college classrooms where I was teaching or in a church where I was preaching in the pulpit. Either way, that became the goal. And I have such a sense of greater satisfaction. And again, all of our callings are different now in recognizing that kind of change, in my ministry at least, is the kind that sticks. It's the kind that people just aren't going to give up. That kind of change takes time. It just does not happen in a moment. And the reason for that has to do with the nature of the context within which changes happen, which is systems, which is what I want to talk about. I've done entire episodes just on systems. So this is going to rehash a lot of that information, but I'm not conveying the information this time. It's the practical side of what it actually looks like. So the reason, pastors and churches have a first run-in at 2 years or 5 years or 7 years or something like that, sometimes it's simply because it takes that much time before any real change starts to take place in that congregation. I saw this recently. We have a new vice president at our college, and I'm not going to tell his story, but he began introducing change into his prior contexts, a really profound change that was invited by those contexts. It was invited by the denomination, invited by other schools. Hey, we'd like for you to do this. We want to promote you and encourage you and build you up because you do this thing of talking about this thing that needs to change in our settings. And so he talked about it. And over time, he started to get traction because he's good. He started to get traction, and people started listening, and people started actually having to think through what it would mean to apply what he was saying. And guess what? Shortly thereafter, he was gone from that context. Because when the change finally does start to come, you realize the cost that's associated with the change, and that you might not be willing to pay that cost, So pastors run into that. Everybody can run into that. So the first thing is that change takes time. So when it does start to arrive, you can expect some conflict to arrive. The second thing is that the promise of change is not at all the same as the change itself. So, and what I don't just mean by that, I promise I'm going to change, and yet change doesn't come. Big shock. I mean more than that. Like even the plan, the system being in play. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to introduce these things, and okay, we've got the program rolling. Now change is going to happen. The expectation that change would come with that is not the same thing as the change actually arriving. There are all kinds of barriers. So the nature of it principally is in the nature of systems. That is, resistance to change. And it's just such an important concept. It's so hard to see if you haven't been in it, but it's just impossible to miss if you've ever started to notice it. Resistance to change takes as long to emerge as the change itself takes to become a real prospect. That nobody resists change when they think it's just words. Nobody cares about that. Well, as your pastor, I'm going to introduce a program so we're all evangelists. Hallelujah. Amen. That's fantastic. Okay, let's go to Burger Hut. Burger Hut's fine. Nothing wrong with Burger Hut. I'm just saying, let's go do our routine, Everything's fine if you can leave and you just go do the stuff you were doing before. The resistance to the change doesn't come because people don't like the idea of change or the promise of change. They love the idea of change. Ooh, I can take this and this will solve my problem. Okay, this is fantastic. Everybody loves the idea of change. But when change becomes a real prospect, the things that were causing us not to change to begin with are going to really show themselves, you know? They're going to start to emerge. And so the resistance to change will also begin to emerge. And again, the reason for that, part of it, is that change isn't isolated. It's not simple. It's not like, why aren't we more evangelistic? Well, we just don't know how to do it. So let's just teach them how to do it. Well, okay, we'll have an evangelism class, and now everybody's an evangelist. There's a whole lot more involved than that, and a whole lot more than just fear of public speaking or fear of other people or fear of looking ignorant or whatever it is. Everything is functioning as part of a system, and I encourage you to go back and listen to episodes. Daisy will link to an episode or two in the past that will give you an opportunity to hear what I mean by systems as I'm talking about them here in the past. I mean, from years ago, we talked about them in other episodes. But, I can think of it this way. In 1980, we had this unbelievable, heat wave. And I mean temperatures over 110 several days in a row. They were over 100, I think 30 or 40 days in a row. I can't remember. It was a ridiculous number of days. I just remember the agony and misery of the summer between my junior and senior years in high school. And so, and we had a swimming pool in our backyard. Yes, I am privileged. Wasn't that great, but we were blessed. It was actually, I did love the pool. We did have a very blessed place to grow up. And so we had a great swimming pool, loved my swimming pool. And there came a day when you jump in the swimming pool and you were just as hot as when you were out of the swimming pool. It was like you jumped in a hot bath. There was just no benefit to getting in the pool. And so people were ordering, we didn't do this, but people were ordering the giant blocks of ice. You know what I'm talking about? Several feet by several feet blocks of ice to put in their pools to cool down the pool. Well, I mean, a block of ice in a pool, it's like 1 cube of ice in a huge bowl of soup. It's not going to cool the soup down. And it didn't cool the pool down. You had to be holding the ice cube in order to cool down. It was just an absurd thought of the solution because there was so much water in the pool than there was in that little block of ice. The point being, systems are a lot bigger than the individual components of change that we try to introduce to them. And so the nature of the system is going to be to melt that little element that you put into it to change it and incorporate it into the nature of the amoeba from before and make change practically impossible. It's just the nature of things. And another way to think of it is, and this is the standard example that people give who talk about systems, it's like changing the temperature in your shower. This is how you would do it if you actually wanted to experience the change. If you change the temperature in your shower, so you adjust the knob, that's you introducing change into a system. Oh, well, let me turn the hot knob so that it's a little more hot water than it was before. So you change the knob. If you change the knob and then you go, well, nothing changed, so I'm going to change it some more, I'm going to change it some more, I'm going to change it some more. Then, by the time the change hits, it's scalding water because you didn't give the system time to respond to the little adjustment that you did make to begin with. And so the delay that you need to have, well, let's change the knob here. Wait. Let's wait to see what the adjustment's going to be. Oh, yeah, that's getting just, oh, yeah. Okay. That delay is you waiting for the system to be affected where you were trying to introduce change. You're waiting for the system to be affected and then stabilize. And you do that so that you can figure out, do we need to pull back a little from the adjustment, add a little to the adjustment? Which one do we need to do? And each one of those is going to require a delay because there's a whole lot more to that system. All the piping from the hot water. Oh, can you just let me off the hook on trying to explain it? You know what I mean in the metaphor. So there's a lot of change in the system that needs to happen beyond simply the introduction that you make of some little element of change. Well, we're going to introduce this course, and that's going to solve the problem of the lack of evangelism in our church or of a lack of growth. And man, how many times have I seen congregations that are struggling with having been plateaued or declining for decades think that having a revival is suddenly going to make the church start growing, Or, and that's just, you know what I mean, a preaching revival. Like, we're going to have 4 services in a row, and now our church will begin to grow. Well, you know what? We'll hire a youth minister with a mohawk. I don't think that would be the thing today, but, you know, back in the 80s, it might have been a thing. Whatever the thing is today, we'll get one with, I don't know, is there some particular tattoo? I don't even know what's cool. I don't even know what to make fun of in the cool category now. That's how far removed I am from cool. The point is, that's not going to do it. There's a lot more in that system that's maintaining the size of the congregation than just that you don't have the right program. There's a lot more to think about there. So you get the idea. You can't just change the temperature on the shower and think that immediately it's going to be the right temperature. It's not what happens. It's the same. But by the way, that cycle with showers, I've seen this so much recently. I've just got to give it as an example. It's exactly like when I watch inexperienced public speakers. I don't mean that insultingly. Not everybody's a public speaker. That's fine. People who just haven't done it a lot. When I watch somebody who hasn't done it a lot speak at a microphone. And so what happens is a lot of times people don't realize that the microphone can only work with what you give it. So you still have to project. You still have to stand up and speak like you're using your diaphragm and speaking to the, whatever. And so they get up and they speak softly. And it's partially because they're just used to speaking to one person at a time. So somebody in front of you. I've just taught all the people around me to get used to public speaking. So they just have to live with being blasted away by me all the time. Not quite. I don't think it's quite that bad. If it is, let me know. We'll see how that adjustment goes for you. Anyway, the point is they speak softly. Well, when they do, guess what the person with audio visuals in the back has to do? They have to crank up the microphone. So they crank up the microphone, and they crank it up until they can finally hear the person's voice. Now the microphone is set so sensitively that it's getting the feedback that comes from the speakers and from the person who is speaking. So the speakers, well, if you can hear the sound of the speakers in the microphone, you're going to create a feedback loop. So you get that whine, whistle, terrible apocalyptic sound that comes through speakers when you've got a feedback loop going. So, the whine. And the AV guy, what's going on? And the speaker backs up from the person who's speaking, backs up from the microphone or speaks more softly, which means the AV person's got to figure out how to turn up the mic even more, which makes them need to, and there's another feedback loop. And then the person speaks softer and they back up more. And then finally, the AV guy is just like, I'm just not going to let him hear him. So you have to turn the mic down, and then you don't hear anybody, and you didn't solve any problems at all, and the person is still not getting across the thing they needed to say to begin with. That's the kind of loop that happens in a system that keeps us from being willing to accept the change that we really need to have. We're just not aware of what we need to do, the direction that we need to go with it. Or, diet and exercise cycles. I mean, this one's super easy to examine because it happens to almost all of us in one form or another, except the people who are extremely genetically blessed, who will eventually, in eternity, answer to God for that condition that they have of perfection. But aside from them, the rest of us deal with this all the time. It's a cycle comparable to what Mardi Gras turns into with Lent. Like, we're going to punish ourselves for 40 days, so let's have a really great Tuesday beforehand, right? So what happens is, we live our lives a certain way, and at some point realize, like I did when I was 30 years old, that we're out of shape. For some people it means being overweight. That's what it meant for me. For some people it means being underweight. For some people it means just being out of shape, that they can't climb stairs without running out of breath, whatever. But it was, we were just living our lives. It's not like we said, I'm going to work for the next few years on trying to be overweight. Almost nobody does that. Instead, except for somebody who's got some role in a movie and they're trying to win an Oscar or something. So most people they're just doing their routine, which guess what? Means they're doing comfortable things. And so the response is, oh, my soul, I'm overweight by 50 pounds. How on earth did this happen to me? And so we react with some version of asceticism, basically. So we're going to punish ourselves. We're going to deny ourselves of any pleasure. And this is how most people think of diets and exercise. I'm gonna run it off. I'm gonna self-flagellate myself with jogging, and it's just a way of saying, well, actually, let me be fair about this. In one sense, that makes sense, because what we were comfortable with did lead us down the path to being unhealthy. That's what makes us, by the way, that's what makes a system hard to change. That we're already doing the things we were comfortable with. That's why we were doing them. So when you introduce change, What you're doing is saying, I want you to stop doing the things you were comfortable with in some way. In that way, it makes sense that when people know they need to do something to get healthier, they need to do something uncomfortable because comfort is what led them to where they are. But in another sense, it's a completely illogical conclusion, as if to say, living comfortably made me unhealthy. Therefore, living uncomfortably will make me healthy. That's false. That is actually a fallacy. It's a converse fallacy, or affirming the consequent, if we had time to explain the whole logic of it. But I will explain one basic idea in the logic of it that's wrong, because some of you are going, well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if I'm living comfortably and that makes me unhealthy, then I should live uncomfortably in order to be healthy. So let me explain what makes that wrong. The only safe way to convert an implication, and the implication in this case is, if I'm comfortable, then I'm unhealthy, which is what has happened over the years. That doesn't mean it has to be true, but in this case, it is true. So we've followed the path of comfort and we became unhealthy. So if I live comfortably, I end up being unhealthy. In order to reverse that, if I want to convert an implication like that, the only safe way to do it, the only safe and certain way to do it is with a contrapositive or something that's equivalent to the contrapositive, meaning I negate both of the terms that I used about comfort and health. I negate both of those terms and then reverse the implication. So in this case, I didn't do that. I negated the terms. If I'm uncomfortable, then that'll make me healthy. I negated the terms because the original one was, if I'm comfortable, I'm unhealthy. So if I negate them, then I am uncomfortable, then I'll be healthy. So I negate the terms, but I didn't reverse them. And that doesn't work. You say, why not? Are you just making up rules? No. Just think about it for a second. If I live in Dallas, then that makes me a Texan. Living in Dallas made me a Texan. I can't just negate the terms. Not living in Dallas will make me a non-Texan. That's not true. I could live in any of the inferior cities around here. That's a joke. I'm not actually an original Dallasite. I don't even believe it. It's just a joke. So the people in Dallas can be happy because they heard it, and the people who are not originally from Dallas can be properly offended by the arrogance that's in Dallas, okay? All right, so everybody should be upset and happy now at the same time. Love the irony of the situation. Anyway, the point is, inevitably, this is the reason that just saying, I'm going to punish myself, that the ascetic response to being unhealthy doesn't change the system for this reason, because inevitably self-punishment is a temporary state. It's a change I introduced and I'm not going to stick with. The negative stimulus loses its force and it's not a negative stimulus anymore. Or secondly, it remains painful and we have to stop doing it. You can't live with it, in which case you revert to your previous behaviors. That's the normal one. That's what happens with diets and exercise plans. Well, I ran every day for a month, but I'm just so sick of it. I got to take a break. And then the breaks get longer and longer, and the running becomes less and less frequent. And finally, we're right back to where we were to begin with. Hence, every gym being packed out in January and completely empty in December. That is not universally true, but man, have I experienced that for decades wherever I've gone to work out. Even just around White Rock Lake, just watching the crowds over the times at White Rock Lake that you have New Year's resolutions or other resolutions, and everybody's out there doing their exercise, not just out there picnicking, but doing their exercise, and so on. You get the point. Systems are hard to change, including the systems that are just a part of our life. So when you apply that to families or churches or other institutions, that there are a lot of ways we could actually introduce change, but it's not going to be easy. You're not just going to do it and suddenly the problem is solved. So when we exercise, Jesus, turn the other cheek, or give them 2 cloaks, give them your coat and your cloak. When we return kindness to aggression, we're saying as Christians, I'm going to introduce change to the system. I'm not going to participate in the conflict that's there. And that's right. That's what we do. That's what we're called to do. So we introduce the kindness, and 2 months later, there's still aggression. We're like, well, what's wrong? Don't reach for the shower knob again. Don't reach for it again. Stick with the kindness. Give it time. Otherwise, it's just a tool. Well, I wanted to use kindness so I could get my way. That's not kindness. That's just a utility. Kindness is a thing in itself. It is part of the fruit of the Spirit that we're supposed to have. So if I'm going to use kindness in response to aggression as a way to introduce change to a congregation, I've got to decide it's worth sticking with no matter how much resistance there is. That's the point. The aggression is what's on the other side. The kindness has to stay there. And then you have to see, how do I adjust this so that I can be more direct in my communication, or that I can be a little kinder in my response to certain situations in order to get this thing at the right temperature so that we're beginning to bring about permanent change. Or it's the same, by the way, with a less moralistic kind of point. It's like introducing planning, and I've experienced this in organizations. It's like introducing planning, strategic planning, for instance, where you're actually thinking long-term. What are the outcomes that we're trying to get at, and how can we create a timeline and some items for action that we could actually implement that would bring about those outcomes? When you're trying to introduce that kind of planning to an organization that's used to shooting from the hip, used to being so fleet of foot that you could just do anything from one day to the next and get wherever you wanted to go. In organizations like that, trying to introduce planning is like saying, we want to kill your free spirit. And that's very difficult for people to accept. So it's not like you're going to introduce planning and everybody's going to go, yeah, let's become a bureaucracy. That sounds cool. They might say it at the beginning, but once you start implementing it, they're going to say, this used to not be so hard, but it also used to not be very effective. So, let's stick with keeping the knob turned where it is right now. Or like we were talking about a moment ago with churches and pastors, seeking out. So I can't tell you the number of times I've seen this one. A church invites me to consult with them because they need to find a new pastor. They need some guidance in what to do with it. And what they've done is created a list of expectations for the new pastor. And the list of expectations is basically a list of grievances about the previous pastor. We don't want a pastor that's like this. We don't want someone who shows up at 10 o'clock and leaves at 2 o'clock. And we don't want, blah, blah, blah. Oh, well, was that something the former pastor did? Yes. I can do that all the way down the list. Okay, so you're just looking for the opposite of your former pastor, which for so many reasons that I don't have time to go into here. But if you do go back and listen to one of the previous episodes about systems, you will hear this because it's what is built into it. It actually means you're going to get the same kind of pastor. You're going to end up with exactly the same thing that you had before. So, pursuing something that hard inevitably ends up chasing it right into the corner where the only thing left is exactly the thing you were trying to avoid. It's a really weird thing to watch happen over and over again. But if you don't want to think about it in terms of churches, think about it in terms of couples that you've known who have gone apart from each other and ended up marrying two other people who were exactly like the original couple were to begin with. It's like, why didn't you just keep the first one? That would have been easier. I'm not even saying that's not a realistic prospect for somebody to leave somebody else. I get why people do that. But to end up with the same thing, wouldn't you think that you would end up with something opposite or completely different? How often have you seen that happen? Almost never, right? That's what I'm talking about here. Same thing that happens here. And so in that kind of a context, you have to think of yourself. Yeah. Like for the congregation, what I want to say to them is, why do you think you have a pastor that was like that? It's because that's what fit this congregation. That's what fit what was going on in this congregation. You say, well, that's not what we told him. It doesn't matter what words you speak. The reality of the relationship between the pastor and the congregation led to that kind of behavior. And again, he's part of it. I'm not saying the pastor never bears some responsibility for what's going on. Absolutely, he does. But the reason congregations and pastors are drawn together is because they're drawn together. So what do you think you're going to draw together next time? If you're a positive charge, you're going to get a negative charge, and vice versa. So on. You get the idea. So third, I've got to work through this more quickly now because we've got to come to a close. So third, the other item that makes this happen, you remember we were going back saying first, the reason it happens, change takes time. Second, the promise of change is not the same thing as the change itself. That's the big one, the one where we were talking about systems. But the third thing is that it's just never permanent. Change is never permanent. And I have notes in my notes that say, well, rarely. And by permanent, I mean enduring. But I really do mean never. It's never permanent. Change is not permanent. So if you think, Ronald Reagan changed the United States, he did. But Reagan wasn't the end. What Reagan was to Jimmy Carter bringing change, Obama was to Reagan, and Trump has been to Obama, and someone else will be to Trump. Change will come to the change that has come. It's never permanent. It's the nature of things. So, what we should think about is, what does that mean that the change that we're introducing isn't going to be permanent, and that no matter how much change we introduce, it's still not going to make things perfect, and we're still going to have to look for other change, and we're still going to run into resistance and blah, blah, blah. And so let me say it in 2 steps. Number 1, that we can't just be content to say that, what we need to do is just replace the pursuit of perfection with being satisfied with something that's sustainable. That's not good enough, because we're told to pursue perfection. 2 Corinthians 7:1, Philippians 3, we're always stretching out for that prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. It's just not enough to sit on our holiness and say, this is holy enough. We're supposed to be bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. Again, those were those 2 references I just gave to you. But we know we can't get to perfection. I know there are a few theologically who think they can, but I don't think realistically we would acknowledge that. So we can't get to perfection. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we can do this. We can commit to a sustainable pursuit of perfection. And this is why I had the conversation today, because that pursuit of perfection means progress. Just change. Progress means change. And I've just spent umpteen minutes explaining why change is nigh unto impossible. But nigh unto impossible is not the same thing as impossible. So what I'm begging for you to do is, in wanting real change, which I hope you do, I hope you want real progress to become more and more like we're supposed to be. What I'm saying is that you need to include this if that's what you want. Number 1, at least an awareness that there is a system. There's something bigger that has to change than what you can do with just a tweak. You'll introduce the tweak, and then you're going to wait and see what it does to the system, and then introduce another, and so on. So at least an awareness that there is a system, and hopefully some details about what might be involved, in that system. So just learning how things work in it and so on, but recognizing how much bigger that is than just the individual change that you're wanting to introduce to it. And then along with that, if you want to introduce real change, you need to include a willingness to introduce that change patiently enough that you can see the whole system settle around that new feature over time. Patient enough to hold the change there long enough to get past all the forces that have been able to keep the status quo, whenever change reared its threatening head before. And then make little adjustments, not to end up right back where you started, not just to give up and revert, but to make adjustments, not to get back where you started or even worse off, but to recognize what can be kept of that change, along with what might not need to be as changed as you originally thought. It's in that way that I would say to people, don't be surprised when the honeymoon ends. But also don't be surprised that you can bring about something that allows you permanently, sustainably, to get better and better over time. That's where we should be headed.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.